Hey there, this is Jeff, one of the authors of the weight loss book Speed, and just bringing you the next installment of a series I'm doing on fiber and its connection to health and weight, and how good the evidence is to support the connections between fiber and those aspects. So this is the second video on this topic. Last week or so, about a week or so, I did the first video explaining kind of what I'm going through, as well as discussed one of the recent papers on fiber. So today I'm going to discuss relatively briefly another recent paper on fiber. This one called, as you can see here, I believe, Health Benefits of Dietary Fiber, published in 2009 in the journal Nutrition Reviews. And they cover a number of the aspects of cardiovascular health, diabetes, obesity, gastrointestinal function, immune function, dietary fiber in childhood, and then just some general conclusions at the end. So I just want to point out a couple things about this paper. Again, it's a very recent paper, about a year old or so. They do state in the abstract at the beginning that overall intakes of fiber are about half of what's recommended for adults and children, and that high intakes of dietary fiber appear to be at significantly lower risk of individuals for developing diseases, so for those that don't get enough. And then fiber supplementation in obese individuals significantly enhances weight loss. So I have a couple issues there. Again, they're talking fiber supplementation, not food, which they do discuss in the paper, as well as saying significant weight loss, which again, statistically it was significant, but I think in real life numbers, often it's not, most people wouldn't consider it significant. So a couple aspects, I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. And then overall, again, they end with the recommended dietary fiber intakes for children and adults is 14 grams per 1,000 kilograms. So again, women usually it's mid-20s, men low 30s because of overall caloric intake typically ingested. I found it interesting for children because the paper I reviewed last week specifically stated that in the abstract and in the paper that appropriate kinds and amounts of dietary fiber for children, along with the critically ill and the very old, are unknown. So that was 2008, it was unknown, and then apparently in 2009 it's known. Just find it interesting, the discrepancy between these two papers on that aspect. Again, this paper really goes in a lot about fiber supplementation, and often that sometimes showing some benefits and not so much from food sometimes. Interesting aspects. So cover a couple things. Again, like the last paper, this one also states most of the available data on disease prevalence and events are from epidemiological studies. So the challenge with epidemiological studies is really detailing cause and effect because of numerous variables, and it's hard to really separate them and know which one specifically is causing the change or the negative aspect. And they do go on just a little bit later dealing with coronary heart disease as while these epidemiological studies are consistent and persuasive, they do not provide specific information about cause and effect. Prospective randomized controlled clinical trials, RCTs, are required to provide convincing data. So again, they're pointing out there, and then they even state in the modern era of fiber research, an early RCT of Welsh men with a history of prior myocardial infarction, heart attack, did not find that doubling their fiber intake affected rates of ischemic cardiac events or death over a short study period of 2 years. Further studies, RCTs, are required to clearly document the links between dietary fiber intake and reduced events. So again, the quality of the evidence, I think, is lacking, really showing that fiber and cardiovascular disease are linked. And again, what always comes up when I'm reading these studies, and I'll get into at later points, because I will cover specifically fiber and cardiovascular disease in the coming weeks, is what about some traditional groups that typically eat relatively low amounts of fiber, yet have virtually no cardiovascular disease? And so how do we explain that? And so again, could just be that fiber is one potential mechanism, but not the only necessary one. So a couple other aspects I thought were interesting. In general, fibers, particularly soluble fibers, do seem to have the ability to decrease LDL some, which is typically good. Though interestingly, they didn't go into particle size, which is quite clear now that there are differences between small and large particles. It's the small, dense stuff that really seems to be atherogenic, not so much the larger, fluffier LDL type. But they don't go into that, which seems to be an omission that shouldn't occur. Blood pressure too seems to have a little bit of effect on reducing blood pressure, increasing fiber or fiber supplementation, more so with people that do have elevated blood pressure. So a little bit there. And again, another one of these, I'm going to go into some of these specific topics and further ones. I want to talk a little bit with diabetes aspect. Interesting, they say the incidence of diabetes has been increasing, and they feel that in dietary changes resulting in less fiber and more fat in the diet. I would actually disagree, particularly about the latter part. Is overall fat intake has stayed relatively constant over a number of decades here. Actually, the amount of sugar and processed carbohydrates has replaced more unprocessed carbohydrates, more high fructose corn syrup or fructose, and also actually an increase in some polyunsaturated fats and some other variables, but not really an overall increase in fat much. I think is pretty weak. Interesting also, they do talk about some moderate carbohydrate diets with or without fiber, the ones with fiber being better at controlling blood sugar, yet they don't discuss, at least briefly it would seem, that, okay, what about the low carbohydrate diets and their ability, which seems to be very good, of improving glycemic control, which has nothing to do with the fiber intake. So I think it should be included in that, and I'm going to do another post as well on fiber and blood sugar control specifically. Let's see. These studies indicate that moderate increases in fiber intake from food or supplements are associated with significant reduction in plasma blood glucose, and particularly the fiber supplementation. And then they go on to say that again, that the type of diet for diabetics should be 55 to 65% of its energy from carbohydrates. I just find that hard to believe with the amount of evidence on lower carb intakes and improvement in glycemic control, insulin function, all that. Not even super low. Let's say 20 to 40% of calories being better than higher carbohydrate, particularly when you start replacing some carbohydrates with more protein and then some of the carbs with fats. And again, obesity aspects, again, mostly of epidemiological studies they talk about. Also, I found it interesting that in a number of the references in this paper, well, not a number, but reference to a specific reference, which I kept looking at, and it's actually not even a published study, it's just a book by the author on fiber. So I felt that wasn't really a good way to reference a number of aspects back to a book when if he was stating that there was a number of good studies that would support a specific aspect the authors were discussing, and the lead author, Anderson, they were referring back to a book instead of referring back to the specific studies. I didn't think that was, I don't think that's a good thing, particularly in published work. Particularly on the aspects relating to obesity and weight management, virtually every reference in that section was to the book and not to studies specifically, which I, again, had issues with. And again, mostly with fiber supplementation. Here's in the comments section, increased fiber are associated with increase in satiety gut hormones, but nothing referenced there. The limited number of clinical trials comparing higher fiber foods with lower fiber foods have provided consistent data to indicate these diets are more efficacious for weight loss than lower fiber control diets. However, randomized placebo-controlled clinical trials have clearly documented that fiber supplementations are accompanied by significantly more weight loss than use of placebos. So again, it seems to be more so related to fiber supplementation, maybe not fiber foods. And again, no references at that point of that aspect. And a couple more things here I wanted to mention as I was going through. They're going through the dietary fiber and gastrointestinal aspects, which I'm going to cover probably next week, going to specifics on that. And so just some final conclusions. Again, most of the stuff that they repeatedly say associated with, which is often weak because most of it's epidemiological studies. And then they go on, there do not appear to be any prospective long-term studies evaluating fiber supplementation related to diseases or outcomes. Also, most of the benefits have been documented with fiber supplements rather than high fiber foods. And so again, overall this information, though interesting, I think there's some decent amount of weaknesses in some of the conclusions that they're having. I also find it interesting that they certainly are harping on fiber supplementation. So again, a supplement, which is often in conservative nutrition circles, supplementation, vitamins, minerals, fats, so forth, often looked at poorly, yet here we're taking a fractionated supplement, just the fiber portion of a food, and saying this is what's going to do it. And though it does seem to have some positive effects on certain markers, does it have really long-term benefits, which is the evidence? There isn't much evidence yet that we know that to support that. So the last thing I wanted to point out was interesting, some conflict of interest here is all the authors for this paper are part of the National Fiber Council. So it's a group that really thinks fiber is the key to many problems that we're having. Also, funding was supported by Procter & Gamble, which makes Metamucil, a psyllium fiber supplement. So again, just some conflict of interest, I think. And again, Dr. Anderson, the lead author, has been a big fiber proponent for many, many years. So again, some biases there that may come into play to skew whether the results portrayed here are really true or not. But anyways, found interesting. Overall, again, some fiber having some benefits, particularly fiber supplementation may be useful. But the next few weeks I'm going to go into specifically about fiber and gastrointestinal health, fiber and glucose control, fiber and weight management, and particularly the weight management is more the focus of what we focus on, but overall just health is important as well. So, well, I hope you found this somewhat interesting, and we'll see you next week.